startups, we don't know how to meet new founders. There's only so many Elons in the world, and that's the limiting factor. You either have a superpower or you don't. You need to be in the top 1 to 15 basis points on some dimension, or the chance you're going to build the next NVIDIA really is zero. Everybody who's a VC, everybody who's an angel investor, everybody who's a seed investor is chasing after the 5, 10, 15 people a year that have a non-zero probability of rearranging the planet to their will.
Windy up here. That is Keith Rabois. It's his second time on the podcast, so I'll keep this brief. Today, he's a managing partner at Khosla Ventures and CEO of OpenStore. Keith is a bit of a legend in the startup world. He's an early investor in names like Airbnb, Palantir, DoorDash, Affirm, Ramp, and YouTube, and has operated at places like PayPal, LinkedIn, Square, and is the co-founder of Opendoor. This makes him a pretty opinionated encyclopedia of knowledge on how to run a company with the rare experience of having been on both sides of the table. I found myself referencing Keith quite a bit, but realized there wasn't an interview that tried to concentrate many of the most important of those practical lessons in one place. So we sat down and gave it a shot. We spoke about the Hollywood model of startups, picking co-founders, identifying, attracting, and assessing talent, raising capital, building a board, delegating, metrics, and knowing what to measure. This is the Rabois podcast.
We choose to go to the moon.
We deliver right to the desktop.
We're going to reinvent the phone.
Takes it again.
The real higher level question here, I think, is the bottleneck to innovation in startups being created in the first place. So in your opinion, which part of the startup value chain is the constraint from us 10xing the number of exceptional startups?
This is really straightforward and really simple.
Capital?
No, capital. There's too much capital chasing too few founders. The scarce resource is world-class founders. People have the potential to be a world-class founder. The idea that you can take a company from scratch, overcome all the inertia, and reinvent an entire industry or change the planet is borderline ridiculous, actually, for most people. And so there's a scarcity of people who, A, are kind of crazy enough to actually embrace that challenge, and then also have the Venn diagram overlap with the skill set, talent, superpowers to pull that off and create the iconic companies. So it's a little bit like Major League Baseball. There's only so many people in the world, the entire planet, that can throw a fastball over 90 miles an hour. And there's only so many, a fraction of them that are left-handed. And if you're not left-handed as a predominant sort of athlete, and you can't throw a fastball over 90 miles an hour, your chance of actually playing in the major leagues as a pitcher rounds to about zero on the entire planet of 4 billion people. And we still have not figured out really how to train somebody who isn't throwing at least 90, 88, 89 miles an hour, how to get over 90. Despite all the advances in science and cameras and technology. And that's true of founders. We don't know how to meet new founders. There's only so many Elons in the world, and that's the limiting factor. Everybody who's a VC, everybody who's an angel investor, everybody who's a seed investor is chasing after the 5, 10, 15 people a year that have a non-zero probability of rearranging the planet to their will.
So if you're a founder and looking for the things that move that needle from being zero to non-zeros,
I don't think you can. I really don't. You either have a superpower or you don't. You can have a superpower and waste it. Lots of people waste talented, God's gifts, intelligence. That happens all the time. It happens in sports too. There's athletes who have potential who get injured. There's athletes who have potential to use drugs and get distracted. But if you don't have a superpower, your chance of creating this company is literally zero. Now, there are ways of finding out whether you might have this superpower or magnifying or amplifying the superpower, but you really need some superpower. You need to be in the top 1 to 15 basis points on some dimension, or the chance you're going to build the next NVIDIA really is zero.
Okay, before we even put pen to paper here, you've done a pretty good job of summarizing your philosophy on where to build. This is a quote: find large, highly fragmented industry with low NPS, vertically integrated solution to simplify value product. Break this down. How do you identify those pockets and why integrate vertically?
Yeah, so fundamentally, this is my pinned tweet. So anybody wants to, consult it, just go to my X profile. You'll find it right on top. The basic, I wouldn't say this is an exclusive formulation. I just think it's a common denominator of many, many, many very successful startups. Vertical integration. Vertical integration is the key to building $1 trillion business. Typically, there are some exceptions. I'd say Meta, Google are not vertically integrated, but most are more vertically integrated. And the reason why is they're very difficult. It's very difficult to get vertically integrated. To build it takes more capital, more time, more talent. But when you build vertical integration, nobody can compete with you for usually 10, 20, 30 years. Let's talk about smartphones. So the only profitable smartphone manufacturer in the world at any scale is Apple. And it's because they're vertically integrated. Nobody can do anything about it. Amazon can't do anything about it. Meta can't do anything about it. Google can't do anything about it because they don't really know how to do vertical integration. Vertical integration means they've integrated the chips, the software, and the hardware to be completely not even symmetrical, actually create accumulating advantages by integrating the combination. So the chips are designed for the use case, the software is designed to take advantage of some of the dimensions of the hardware is designed around the limits and advantages of the software. Those are all reinforcing. And it's gonna take 30 years before someone creates a competitive device.
Got it.
Probably what happens is devices go away before someone figures out how to compete with Apple successfully and build a profitable device.
In a lot of ways, the first week, the first month, the first 6 months of a company's existence are the very, very most important in determining its trajectory. And in this context, you talked a lot about the Hollywood model of startups, like in excruciating time and detail, identifying the key solvable variables that will affect your company's trajectory, and then recruiting co-founders that burn down those core few key risks of a company, like casting for a movie. Is this fundamentally at odds with the common sort of Silicon Valley advice of essentially talking to users, throwing stuff at a wall, and seeing what sticks?
Yeah, 100%. So it's a bit of like the canonical question, is mathematics discovered or invented? So I don't believe startups are discovered, I believe they're invented. You forge it through willpower. So it's like a movie, you have a vision of how the world could be better, how an industry could be better, how a product could be better, and then you execute across that vision, and that requires producing the movie, which is, involves capital, casting, and then creating trailers, which is basically your marketing, and selling tickets, which is really your revenue. And so just like a movie, you start with a vision of what could be, and then you turn that into reality, and then you hopefully turn that into both a critically acclaimed movie and a blockbuster.
When starting a company, how should you think about the macro why now versus micro timing? So what I mean by that is Amazon was started only a year after the World Wide Web was released into the public domain, but Google was the 11th search engine. How do you reconcile
Well, I don't think why now means like, are you first, second, third, fourth, or fifth? Why now is what enabling technologies, what enabling sea change has occurred in the world, what's changed? Because like if you think about this concept of inertia is your worst foe as a startup, as a founder. The world just isn't going to suddenly embrace you. And you need to create momentum, literally in the physics sense. So inertia into momentum. If you can identify a crack in the world where things are are volatile, or things are in transition, there's often an opportunity to ride a wave of momentum that you don't have to create from scratch. Creating your own momentum from scratch is either very painful or very expensive. So if you can identify someone else's wave to ride, this is a little bit what happened with NVIDIA. They were smart enough, they were really doing gaming chips, smart enough to see somewhere in their data that these AI consumption use cases were starting to become important, and then double, triple, quadruple, 10x down, and everybody else, the Intels, the AMDs, completely missed it. So that's what propelled, among a lot of other things, but that wave of AI starting and noticing that wave versus everybody else ignoring it with blinders enabled NVIDIA to be the company that we see today. So the why now can be the beginning of the AI wave. The why now can be people are going to have, a computing device in their pocket. Think about the mobile wave. But to try to identify where the world's, kind of in transition, and then trying to capitalize on that. You can create startups from scratch through willpower and create your own momentum. But it's a hell of a lot easier if the world kind of is changing in flux, and you're taking advantage of capitalizing on that.
Yeah. You talk a lot about integrating vertically, obviously, but how should you know whether or not to go multi-product? Is that something that should be baked in from the outset, or something that is responded to if the market sort of sets up?
I think it's opportunistic more often than intentional, meaning you start with a product, it resonates, you have product market fit, you're doing really well successfully as a startup, and you see there's other value propositions that your customers are demanding, and they're logical extensions of what you already do, is the best way to go multiple product. The ways that are less attractive but sometimes happen in SaaS businesses is the economics of your business aren't very good. They're mediocre, so your payback time on sales and marketing against your revenue can be acceptable but not exciting. And so that drives, from a top-down perspective, the CEO to say, I want to have multiple products to kind of expand the lifetime value. That's a lot less exciting than when it's fairly organic and the customer is basically saying, please help me solve this other problem. You've been excellent at what you do. I've got this problem over here, and there's some synergy between what you've already created and what you're expanding into.
Got it. There's a question of how a lot of this sounds in theory versus how it actually plays out in practice. You back a lot of really successful companies at the earliest stages. Of the most successful, call it top 10, how many of them roughly scaled and executed against the same key risks and on the same idea that they identified at the outset?
I'd say 70%. It also depends upon when you're going to demark and start measuring from time of raising seed capital. It's probably 80 to 90%. From time the founder started the company, it might be more 60. But by the time I intercepted many of these companies as the early stage or first institutional investor or angel investor, it's probably 80 to 90%, but if you dial it back before they actually pitched me, it might be like as low as 60. The ones that have succeeded in evolving, I think it's more like the term, people talk about pivoting, but they forget the derivation. Like in basketball, you're only allowed to pivot if you keep one foot on the ground. You can't move both feet. So a pivot where you have a foundational principle and you're editing your direction based upon that foundational advantage, that can be very attractive. So for example, we can talk about the origins of PayPal. PayPal was we're going to beam money from Palm Pilot to Palm Pilot company. And the foundation of that, though, is we needed a unique identifier per person, per user. And that was an email alias. So the email alias was the critical ingredient. And then as the Palm Pilot world wasn't really exploding as much as forecast, and the use cases back in 1999 and 98 around beaming money to each other weren't so obvious, people did recognize that the email alias was a more universal, more approachable, and more broad product extension. And that was the foundation of PayPal, was the email alias. And so it wasn't like completely abandoning the heritage of the company.
Right. Okay, let's talk about starting a team. You said the biggest lesson you learned from Vinu and Khosla is that the team you build is the company you build. I mean, like any good advice or wisdom, it sort of is something that you know is true, but when it's expressed, it becomes that much more, impactful. That said, team building and ensuring that the foundation of a team is as strong as possible, you said, it's like working with concrete. When it's liquid, you can shape it, and once it solidifies, you have to take a jackhammer to it to fix it, which is very noisy and expensive. In the case of co-founders, that fix can be fatal. What are the least obvious but most important traits to have in co-founders in making sure that your founding DNA is correct from the start?
I think there's two principles in identifying co-founders and co-founder matchmaking. One is simply a compliment, which is everybody who is a successful founder, as we discussed, has a superpower or more. But typically, they also have things that they're either weak at or don't like to do. So having a compliment. And the best possible compliment may vary by your business objectives, the market you're in. Sometimes it's a technical compliment. Sometimes it's a sales compliment. Sometimes it's a marketing compliment, a product compliment. So identifying your strengths and what are the gaps in your DNA. Then secondly, I think it's important to have alignment around first principles. So you don't want to be debating, are we in office versus remote? That's not constructive. You cannot have that debate every month. But the application of principles with a founder who's insightful, that is very helpful. So someone who can help clarify your thinking, makes your thinking better. You can actually usually tell, even in a coffee, whether someone can help you clarify your own thinking. When I meet somebody new that I'm potentially recruiting for some role, in that coffee conversation, they usually ask very sharp questions that make me pause and think about the problem set or the challenge I've been working on in a different light. And if they can't do that in the first hour, usually they can't do it after the first 6 months.
Peter Thiel taught you that as a startup, you need to recruit undiscovered talent because if talent is easily legible, they usually get hired away by someone more well capitalized. I think it's Eric Lyman at Rand who calls this the Moneyball strategy.
Yep.
What are specific reasons someone can be mispriced? Like what shapes or archetypes of individuals should you be keeping an eye out?
Yeah, so fundamentally when you start a startup, you're like 1 to 2 people sitting in a proverbial garage. And you have to compete with talent with OpenAI or Google or Meta or Apple or NVIDIA. And so you have to have some advantage, some comparative advantage. The mispriced talent is almost surely the most appropriate advantage you can sort of create and forge. It's difficult, but like at a conceptual level, you're looking for talent that these large companies just don't know how to process accurately. So lack of data points, I like the legible concept. If someone's very young and early in their career, they may not have enough data points to read. So you find a 19-year-old, does Google know how to assess a 19-year-old? Are there enough data points? Maybe not. That's great. Second thing is most large companies, not all, but most become sort of homogenous in their hiring process. And so people who have disruptive characteristics break the mold. Those people can be very, very, very high leverage. So if you identify people who have like a screw loose somewhere, a standard homogenous hiring process where everybody has an effective veto will tend to eliminate those people too. So you can identify those types of people. You can sometimes find geographic talent that's become more difficult in the last 10 years than 20 or 30 years ago, where there's places that large companies aren't looking. I think that's a lot less common and available now, but 20 years ago, you probably could create geographic arbitrage, but you should be able to isolate at a minimum of the founders. Why don't I have some alpha here that other people are going to miss? It could be also historical experience. Like, for example, if you've known someone for 15 years, perhaps you have data points that aren't going to show up on a LinkedIn profile, that aren't going to be processed in a standard hiring process. So that can be a competitive advantage too. It's hard to scale that. Almost nobody has relationships, over X period of time with enough people to scale a company. But selectively, that can be very strategic.
Gotcha. Okay, let's talk about how to hire and sort of rock down the list here, starting with attracting talent. I think like sort of an underrated aspect of this entire process is that Silicon Valley itself has become a little more consensus, right? Like it's become sort of a common career path for like a Harvard grad went before. It used to be, really the opposite.
Only the misfits. Yeah, when I started my career, or at least when I graduated from Stanford, only the misfits who couldn't get real jobs started companies. Yeah. Like that was literally true when I left Stanford. And then, after the social network, I think is how many people demark the change. It became a mainstream career occupation that was aspirational for quote unquote normal people. Another way to restate this is last June, I interviewed Max Levchin, founder of PayPal firm, on stage, and this video is available publicly. And he described me as the most normal person that worked at PayPal. So to show you, we had 254 people in Mountain View, and I was the most normal one. That was kind of the set of characters that went into startups. I don't think I'd be the most normal person at most startups today.
Okay, so fast forward to today, right? With more options, more noise, more average people, you need to get pretty good at attracting great talent. So what are practical ways to cut through the noise and not just attract people, but attract the right kinds of people?
So I think there's two principles. The canonical advice is you have to have a mission that's compelling. And I think there are some companies that can create such a differentiated mission. I think Anduril is a really good example of this, dialing this back of, we're going to make America great. We're going to protect democracy. We're going to use technology to insulate democracies from authoritarian and totalitarian regimes and terrorists. So that was contrarian and differentiated in 2016, 17. Less so now, but that was a magnet and attraction for a certain type of people. Palantir had that a decade earlier, or maybe even 15 years earlier. And so I think that those kind of missions can be compelling and create the right sort of signal to noise ratio of candidate to candidates. If you don't have that much of a differentiation, then I think you need to use other techniques. And those are more challenging, actually, in a world where everybody's getting funded. In a hot market, much more difficult challenge for founders than when the market collapses. When the startup market is difficult, it's easier to cut through the noise as a company, as a new company. So I think then you have to have a compelling answer to an old Peter Thiel question, which is, how are you going to recruit your 20th employee? You can recruit your first 10 through personal connections, through will, but after that, you need a really strong answer. Why is this person who has incredible talent going to join you versus all the other options? Now, again, back to the point about recruiting people that have some alpha. If the people are going to get excluded from a lot of other options, you can close. So that's great. You have to create momentum after the first 10 or 20 anyway. Momentum does attract talent. It doesn't always attract the right talent, and you have to filter. I think cultural values can work. So if you have really, just like you have a crisp vision that is differentiated, if you have non-mundane, non-trivial, non-banal cultural values, that can be a signal to the right kind of people. So if you say we're going to do X and that's very different than Y, that can bring in the right people too. So having very strong cultural principles that are differentiated from the rest of the planet does create a nice signal to noise ratio.
So from attracting to assessing, looking back on your time at PayPal, you realized you were actually pretty bad at assessing prospective hires, but you were much better at getting to read on friends and existing employees. Turns out you weren't bad at assessing talent, you just were bad at assessing strangers, right?
Yes.
So when you don't have years to get to know people, which is in most cases if you're hiring, what are some practical ways to get data points on someone quickly, and specifically what should you be looking for?
It's really difficult. You may have to invest the time and energy to get data points. It's like as a VC, I have the same problem I confront every single day. So I meet a founder for the first time, and then 20 to 40 minutes I have to decide whether we're going to seriously consider investing. And if I have only those 20 or 40 minutes, that's a pretty limited data set to draw a line about the potential slope of this person and this team over the next decade. So if you think about it from math, again, geometry, you can draw an infinite number of lines through one data point. If I have any more experience with this person or this team, drawing those lines becomes much more tractable and much more accurate. If I have a lot of data points with this person, I should make that call every time. So for example, let's be very concrete. When my friend Max Rhodes and his co-founders were raising money for Faire in 2015, many people misassessed both the opportunity and the team. Max had worked for me for 2.5 years. I played soccer with him for probably 4 or 5. And so I just need to make that call perfectly. I have so many more data points and so much more context that I should never be a VC if I can't make that call every time. Now, when I have to make a call competing with like the Alfred Linds at Sequoia, where we have the same data points, that's going to be challenging to have more alpha and be more right than him. So for example, he did make the wrong call in the seed. He didn't invest because he listened to the general wisdom about the team in the market. Later, he realized he was wrong, and Sequoia is on the cap table, and we're very excited about having them as partners and building the company. But it's really difficult when you only have a limited data set. And the same thing, when I was considering leading the seed round for DoorDash, there was 17 different startups trying to do some version of food delivery. And people always ask me this question, well, how'd you know to back DoorDash? I was like, well, Tony was an intern at Square. I knew Tony, and I was like, well, if we're gonna bet on anybody, if anybody could solve this problem, which is a really hard math problem actually, to get deliveries per hour to the threshold where you can be profitable is really a math problem, a routing problem on drivers or dashers. And I was like, Tony's brilliant. He's math major, undergrad. He should be able to solve this, or it's not solvable. And so having an unfair advantage of having worked with Tony and knowing his background led me to make that call much more accurately than other people.
Got it. Going on to, you mentioned, Tony, this is a nice segue. A chronically overlooked aspect of this process of hiring often is doing proper references on people. Tony notoriously did 20 reference checks for any one candidate. What do most people get wrong about references, and how do you do them well?
So I think, there's a big debate here. So Tony mentioned on stage when I was interviewing him last year that he does 20 references for any critical hire. Vinod Khosla recommends about 10. I think References are challenging though, because most people, well, let's talk about founder references and references for hiring. I think references for hiring are no brainer. At a minimum, you should perform 3 to 10, period. References for founder are tricky because most people are calling don't know how to assess a potential founder. They're thinking through the lens of an employee. And founders are different. And so, for example, applying the Faire metaphor, one of the reasons why my friend Alfred and several other investors passed was they did references on Max and they weren't particularly good. Max was not the best employee, trust me. But if you had asked the question, does he have the potential to be an outstanding world-class founder? The answer is obviously yes. But if you ask the wrong question, like, is this person great at their job? The answer would have been no. So you need to know what you're asking. So for example, one savvy investor I know did actually call Jack Dorsey and asked him about Max. And Jack was accurate and said Max actually can be a great founder. But if you just ask general people who worked at Square, his strengths and weaknesses, you'd have got a lot of more mediocre answers about his, talent as an employee because he didn't, for example, listen to direction very well.
Yeah. Okay, just because you found someone talented and mispriced and you've assessed them properly doesn't mean they don't have other options and doesn't mean they're fully bought in. How do you close a prospective hire effectively? I think it's Mike at Traba who talks about anti-selling.
Well, Mike uses the anti-sell process at Traba, which is basically to really amplify their cultural values, which includes really Olympian work ethic, in-office culture, et cetera. And it's not really to close the candidate, it's to more filter the candidate, sort of the discussion we had previously. Make sure that they're hiring the right people, to really close strongly highlighting the differences from the other companies, to make sure the individual is opting into the right. I mean, hiring is a matchmaking process. And so you want to hire the right people for your company. And so that's the anti-sell part. I think for closing, I think the best way to close is typically, I start with asking the candidate what they're optimizing for. What are they optimizing for? What are they trying to get out of their opportunity? And so because of this matchmaking, depending on what their goals are, it may or may not be the right fit, but at a minimum, I can address their goals and explain and articulate how this particular company, this particular role helps advance their own goals. Second, I think that the other thing you want to do is talk about the challenges, which are, here's the muscles you're going to build. Here's the excitement, you personally and the company. And I think that's what motivates the best people are challenges and building muscles, intellectual muscles. Challenges motivate people. And challenges, I used to say when I was young, challenges propel me. And so I think that's true of talented, ambitious people. And so you really want to highlight the challenges. And I think that can be very effective. And then finally, on closing, a little technique that Jack Dorsey taught me at Square, which is he would always ask candidates that he wanted to hire. Last kind of question in an interview context would be, is there anything that would stop you from accepting an offer? And then because he would attempt to extract what the blocker's concerns were, what are you concerned about? He could then directly address them. I think sometimes there's concerns and they're sort of suppressed. And so sometimes candidates reject offers and you don't even really understand why. And then later you learn and you're like, oh, that's a stupid reason. That was dumb. I could have answered that in a split second. So I think Jack being transparent and clear and provoking actually is very effective.
Got it. Next point in the step here is promoting. Brian at Airbnb doesn't believe in general managers. Whoever's the best at the specific thing manages the
That's an old PayPal technique that Peter really probably created.
Yeah. In his words, a manager who doesn't know how to do the job is they're managing is like a cavalry general who can't ride a horse. That often means promoting internally. Your framework for understanding when to promote comes down to whether an employee's personal growth rate is outpacing the growth rate of the company.
Exactly.
What are good signs someone's scaling, that their growth is outpacing that of the company or even vice versa?
Well, the easiest way is kind of a Brian Chesky technique, which is how far ahead of the curve are they thinking? So a person, an executive, a leader who's just delivering goals just in time, pretty good, and especially for a high growth company, that alone can be pretty impressive. However, what you really want is someone who can think 3 to 6 months ahead of the curve and is seeing, because different solutions and different solutions to challenges have different lead times. And so if you can think 3 or 6 months ahead, you can invest ahead of the lead time that's required to address problems. If you can just think in time, a lot of potential opportunities that would have been effective are ruled out because the lead time is too long. So that's why you want roughly 3 to 6 months ahead of the curve. They're like, where are the blind spots and how far ahead is this person thinking? So they can, they're really most amazing execs, sort of when a problem arises and you think there's going to be a significant challenge and you're talking to them, they're like, nope, already thought of that. I've got this, this, and this ready to go. And you're like, okay, great. And it happens, like, for example, I'll give you a very specific illustration, but it is metaphorically applicable to almost every role. So in the technical world, sometimes, your traffic can grow 10, 100x. Imagine the old example would be like some high profile TV show would feature your website, think Oprah back in the day. And your traffic, would spike by 10 or 100x in that hour. So a really strong architect back in the day would have thought this through 50 different ways. And they would have had to have extra hardware available. They would have thought about all the moving pieces. They have CDNs that they can layer on, blah, 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 blah. So when you go on Oprah or NBC News, whatever, back in the day when they had traffic, would feature you, nothing would ever break. But unless you thought about that months in advance, actually with hardware, sometimes a year in advance, there was no way your servers could keep up with that spike in traffic, and then you lose all the opportunity. And so this is true in marketing, it's true in every part, it's just a little less easy to explain, but you always want to be thinking that far ahead. If this were to happen, what would I do? And then when your executive looks at you and says, this is happening, you're like, okay, no problem, we'll just go in here, 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 and then if this doesn't work, then we'll go here, 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 and here. That's a great leader.
It seems that at some point in a company's life cycle, there's going to be some regression toward the mean in the quality of hires that you bring on. You can help combat this by making sure your first 10 employees are excellent, and that your company and people around you are extremely, culturally aligned, which we'll talk about in a bit. But a great way of doing this is by interviewing candidates yourself for a really long time. How long should you continue interviewing for a CEO? When does that trade-off stop making sense?
Well, I'm not sure it ever really stops making sense. I believe Tony at DoorDash said he kept up for about 2,000 or so employees. That's pretty high. I think at Square, for the most part, either Jack or I interviewed everybody for the first 500. And I don't think you need a homogenous answer, by the way. I think there can be subcomponents of your team where the leader of that team has proven that the talent on his or her team is exceptional, extraordinary, and they know how to scale their team. And you can maybe relax a bit in just that sector and then still insist upon interviewing candidates in every other role. It doesn't make all the other executives thrilled when you do this, but it does work. It allows you to leverage your time and say, I'm going to interview 80% of new applicants. But this engineering team, everything about them is world-class. The leader has hired, hundreds, and all the caliber keeps going up, and blah, blah, blah. You say, I'm not going to try to second guess this person because they've proven the hiring muscle. And what you have to explain to the other executives is there's a difference between how well you do your job sometimes, like how effective are you at executing, and your muscle at hiring. And they're different skills. They're related, but they're different. And so sometimes you have a first-time leader who's been promoted, who's extraordinary. That's why he or she's been promoted. However, they haven't yet hired 100 people in their career. So they may or may not be perfect at hiring yet. And you definitely want to help calibrate.
Longer term, structurally, how do you think about creating a monopoly on talent? So for example, SpaceX for a while, and still to an extent, had a monopoly on really exceptional aerospace engineers. So to the extent you aren't building the only company in the sector, what else can you do here?
Well, I think that is true. Building a monopoly in a sector is a great idea. SpaceX, OpenAI, I think to some extent when it started, other than DeepMind, at Google, really was a monopoly for people who had world-class AI ability on the research side. And that was actually the fundamental premise of our investment. So, as many people know, KV was the first and only institutional investor in OpenAI's first external financing round. And the basic thesis, other than my partners and I knowing Sam really well and having confidence and conviction about his abilities, was this was the only critical density of world-class AI talent ex-Google. And so would you take that bet? Sure, take that bet all day long. If you're the only alternative to Google succeeding in AI in the Western world, that seems like a pretty reasonable investment hypothesis. That was literally the investment hypothesis. So if you don't have the ability to create and forge a monopoly in a unique industry taking advantage of unique skill sets, it is much more difficult to achieve a monopoly on talent. And I think you can break through sometimes, which is like once a year or so, there's a startup that just goes like vertical. And because of that, they have an unfair advantage in recruiting talent. I'd say Ramp has been able to do that, where Ramp has been extraordinary literally from day one to basically day five. We're going to do our fifth year board meeting in a few hours. And I think they've been able to create a monopoly on a certain type of engineering talent. And our intern class, it's sustained. Our intern class for the last 2 years is by far the best on the planet. And so that should propel us for another few years. So, but you need that vertical, sort of execution roadmap and the metrics that support that to create a different kind of monopoly.
Okay, let's talk about raising capital. So we've started a company, we built a small team, now let's talk about fundraising. You have a great analogy that a startup is kind of like an airplane taking off. People often fundraise with the idea of extending runway when they should actually be paying attention to hitting milestones, in essence, whether their plane is actually lifting off. Raising too much money can even be dangerous because it makes you spend against that amount. But that in mind, how much money is the right amount to raise, and how can you work yourself backward into that number in your own specific case?
I think the most important thing is to define what Lyft means. What is Lyft for us? And Lyft for us is both an internal goal, but also something that external people will accept / be impressed by, sort of validate externally. And so depending on what kind of startup you are, what stage you're at, identifying the Lyft can be different. But you want to be very specific. If we do X, Y, and Z, we will have achieved Lyft. So in a deep tech startup, that might be different. It might be, we can put a rocket, up here or something. We can do this. And, in a more classic business-oriented financial startup, it might be some growth rate at some payback or some, whatever the case is. Then working backwards from that Lyft, how much money will it take us to achieve that inflection? Think of an inflection. What are the 2 or 3 inflection moments for this company? And then we're going to shoot for proving this inflection in this financing. It's also a good way to raise capital, by the way. When you sit down in front of investors with your keynote deck, you want to say, here's where we are, and here's the next inflection for my company. And this is what I need capital to achieve this inflection, and here's why. And then once you achieve that inflection, by definition, the valuation will go up by 3, 4, 5, 6x. So it's a pretty consistent, coherent sort of worldview of financing.
As far as screening investors themselves goes, your partner Vinod Khosla says 70% of investors are actually valued attractive. I think it's hilarious. I think it's probably true. Besides the table stakes, which are unfortunately rare, someone who will at least do no harm, has a good brand, will, to an extent give you cheaper, less dilutive capital and like a quick and minimally distracting fundraise process, and to otherwise stay completely out of the way, what should you be looking for in an investor?
Well, I think let's defer the harder question of what you should be looking for, and let's go to the simple technique. I think the biggest mistake founders make is they don't do reference checks on investors. And it makes no sense to me. It is much easier for me to fire a founder than it is for a founder to fire me. And so if anything, the level of scrutiny and diligence I do should be greater that the founder does on the investor and the other way around. But almost no founder, very few, take that seriously. And that's how you figure out the matchmaking exercise. Because I am actually a better partner for some founders than other founders. Even within our portfolio, there are founders in the KV portfolio that are better fits with me, and there are some that would be a better fit with my partner David Wyden or Vinod or Sven or Samir. And so sometimes we actually discuss this internally about when a company comes in to present, who's the best pairing, and it may be different actually than the person who's sort of sourced the original opportunity. And sometimes even years later, we will switch and swap. So I think it's very critical. So there are things I am particularly good at as an investor and giving as a consigliere and a mentor sometimes. And there's things that David is extraordinary at, for example. And there's things that Vinod is much better than me at. And so depending on what the company needs, what the founder needs, every founder and every company is different. Every founder has different superpowers. Some have strong financial acumen, some have none. Some have, great technical prowess. Some have very limited. And so you're pairing there. And then the stage of the company, sometimes you need different things. In the beginning, you may need unfair advantages in hiring and assessment culture. Later, you may need IPO preparation stuff. And so that also changes. But I just think founders are often superficial and negligent in doing reference checks. Sometimes it's really easy. You're comparing two offers. The best case is you have multiple offers. Great. The best way to do a reference check is, let's say you have two offers, from these two VCs or these two partners. Go find 5 founders that have worked with both. If it's someone who's been in the business, good news is many people in venture, have been doing this. I've been doing this for starting my 13th year. Some people in venture sometimes do it for 20, 30, 40 years. So it's often easy to find 3 or 4 or 5 founders that have worked for the same person. So again, let's talk about it. I'll give you a specific example. Let's say had this great opportunity to take a term sheet from Alfred, Lynn at Sequoia, or me. We probably overlap with 5 or 6 different founders that we work with closely. And you should call them all up and ask them what are the differences. And you're going to get, actually, I'm sure all these people like Alfred and will get positive reviews. And most of them probably like me. But there are differences in what I can do to help a startup and what he can do, even though our advice is actually quite consonant, almost all the time. And that's why we like working together. But a founder could choose very wisely. And that's where you're grading, very much at the margin. Most of the time you're choosing between someone who's much worse than Alfred and me. But founders should take this more seriously.
Okay, let's talk about boards, speaking of people that are really hard to fire. You said one of the best ways to fill the board of directors is to find people you wish you could hire but are in positions in their lives where it's not really feasible. So, similar question, when should you build a board and what specific traits should you look for in board members?
Yeah, so this was Jack Dorsey's philosophy at Square. We had a very high profile, very talented, ambitious board literally from the very beginning. So we recruited people like Larry Summers to our board. We had Roloff, who leads Sequoia, on our board. We had Mary Meeker on our board. We had a phenomenal board. And these were people that could all add value. And basically the point of a board is to identify blind spots. When a CEO makes a mistake, it's a very expensive, sometimes fatal mistake. And so what board members can do because of their peripheral vision or depth of experience is highlight things and clarify your thinking so you don't create an unforced error. And that is extraordinarily valuable. Sometimes an unforced error sets you back a year, sometimes permanently. And so having people that can pressure test your thinking is extraordinary. People say that, and sometimes you hear people say and articulate views that you can do this without a board. I just don't really believe it 99.9% of the time. The reason why is typically if you try to do it through a non-board structure, the advisor person doesn't have enough context to be useful. There really aren't that many people on the planet that at a 50,000 foot level should be able to give you feedback if you're a world-class founder. That person really needs to have 10, 20,000 foot visibility to be useful. And I think other than a board construct, we haven't created too many scalable ways to provide enough and sufficient context where you can provide value. There are people like Mark Andreessen, generally doesn't take board seats. Vinod doesn't take board seats except at Square. And so I think you can create structures. I know, for example, the way Vinod does this is once a month or once a quarter, he'll do an update, a review sort of with a founder and expect a presentation that's pretty detailed. And that does allow his brain to train on the information, the context, so that he can be, value creating in that hour and a half session. but it's really challenging. And Vinod's also been doing this 40 years and is much more clever and smart than virtually everybody else. And that's why maybe Mark Andreessen is also much more clever and sharp and has been doing this for like 35 years also, maybe able to pull this off. Most other advisors are not Vinod Khosla or Mark Andreessen.
Okay, let's get into how to operate. For context here for a minute, you're generally of the belief that most MBA-esque wisdom is bad. That hiring good people and empowering them to do their jobs sounds nice on the surface, and it even could be, but it could also destroy your company. This is because people default to hiring since they want to manage people, new teams get created, bloat means nothing gets done, people get complacent so you can't tell good employees from bad ones, and the cycle perpetuates itself. So to avoid all of this, you need to be completely accountable and hands-on at all times.
Period. Great. All said. I have nothing to add.
Let's start with identifying problems in your organization. You have this metaphor of triaging, that running a startup is a bit like the ER. Some things might look like problems that are actually self-recovering and will go away. Others are actually problems that need treatment. How do you create a system for identifying the most important things, and how do you discern a cold from the flu?
Yeah, so any healthy startup, meaning vibrant, high potential startup, is a bit chaotic actually. Process is not your friend, and it should be a mess. The process of innovation is messy. It's not an original quote, but like basic concept. And so what you're really doing is trying to identify which piece of the mess to fix, in what order and why. And that's why I use the hospital nurse triaging concept, because everybody comes into an ER, has some symptoms, there's a reason why they're there. Most people don't like to go to the ER, so there's a good filtering mechanism. And most messes in a startup kind of have that, like generally by time something rises to your attention as CEO or founder or co-founder, there's some symptoms. And it'd be nice to be proactive and devote attention before there's symptoms, but often you're somewhat reactive. And the key is isolating where there's a high leverage, like high level asymmetric upside or downside. And so this is the flu issue, which is, you have a flu, it's annoying, but if you wait 5 days and drink water and stuff, it'll kind of pass. There are times that things that look superficially like a flu or the cold. If you wait, the patient dies. And that's why there's an art and a science to emergency room triaging. There's a checklist that actually they apply to make sure that the patient dies. Unfortunately, there's not a great checklist for startups. The art part probably predominates over the science, and there's some benefits of wisdom. But what you're really doing is looking at this problem and saying, if I don't do anything here, are things going to get 10x worse? Because if not, you want to substitute that attention energy, your brain power, your scarce energy, to finding things that have 10x upside. And then you ask the same question, which is, if I intervene here, if I spend time, if I double click here, if I do some work or editing by myself, can I forge a 10x advantage? Can I reduce our marginal cost by 50%? Can I accelerate our growth by 50%? These things compound. So you basically want to constantly be channeling your energy to things that have asymmetries. Classic power law kind of problem. So it's always like filter. If 10% just doesn't matter unless I can compound that 10% times 10 years. And so I've got to isolate what am I paying attention to and why? What's the potential of the issue asymmetrically? And if it's not, just let the chaos bake a bit and it'll resolve itself.
You have another great framework that the job of a CEO looks more like that of an editor than a writer. That a CEO, you review all of the work, and when you do, it's about simplifying initiatives and clarifying goals with that writing, then allocating resources and delegating against them. And this is all in the interest of ensuring a consistent voice, being a broken record in your words and your actions that, hey, these are the one or the two or the three things that we're focused on, this is how we're accomplishing them, and this is who's working on them, and repeating. In being crystal clear about that vision, where you're going, and what your goals are as a company, in what other ways can you ensure consistent voice?
Well, I do think consistent voice matters, especially in anything that's touching the customer. And I think, generally speaking, as your organization scales, you have seams in your organization, different leaders from different backgrounds. And so it starts showing up, the products you ship start showing inconsistencies. And so the editorial metaphor of like, this is borrowed from Jack Dorsey, like when you read The Economist, every article you read in that issue has a very consistent voice. And it would actually confuse you if you read an article that was out of tone with the rest of the issue. And so having an editorial standard like The Economist is what you want to do as a CEO. And so often, because you do have leaders that have come from different backgrounds with different depths of experience, you're editing to harmonize the tone. And that's very valuable so that customers feel that the website's consistent with the marketing, which is consistent with the product, which is consistent with the value proposition some salesperson told them, and it all feels like one unified voice.
Another interesting point you make about operating is that if you want people to make the same decisions as you need to give them the same information. One way you talk about doing this is literally having clear, open conference rooms, an open floor plan, and open sourcing notes from meetings even. What are other practical ways that you can create transparency?
Well, I think data transparency is critical, whether it's dashboards everywhere, it can be done by email, but quantitative context, access board decks. So we always, in every company I've been involved in, we go slide by slide through every board presentation and don't edit it, and like try to replay the conversation where we can. And so I think you want to give, this is kind of a Netflix principle, like lack of context is like usually the problem. And so CEO has constant context by definition. And usually what frustrates a CEO when they get annoyed or miffed at an executive or employee is there's a delta in context, which is why the employee or deputy has gone astray. But it's ultimately the CEO's responsibility to disseminate as much information so that everybody has the same context, which means more often than not, people will come to the right decision sort of naturally.
You talk a lot about barrels, effectively these very rare force multiplying individuals in an organization who have the ability to take a concept from inception to fulfillment, rallying people around the idea and going through those tough valleys when things aren't going so well. More practically, you talk about the need to constantly expand the scope of responsibilities for people and give them increasing degrees of freedom in order to find their true capacity and identify those unique people. What specific common trait do they share, and what makes them so rare in the first place?
Well, let's start with the concept of barrels and ammunition and back into this. Many CEOs hire a lot of people, and then they look around and they feel like they're getting less done, or they're certainly not getting more done, in a greater than linear fashion, and they get frustrated. It's like I took a hiccup from 50 to 100, and we get no more done, or less done, or 2x done, but not 3x. The reason why I think behind this is there is a coordination tax. Every time you add employees, there's more time coordinating and communicating against the increased productivity. But the fundamental root cause of the problem where incremental hiring does not improve output is that very few people within your organization are going to be barrels. And what a barrel is, as you described, is someone who can take a concept and turn it into reality. And those people are incredibly scarce. A rough ratio in a healthy company might be, you might have 2 or 3 barrels per 100 or 200 employees. And that defines the number of simultaneously challenging projects the organization as a whole can embrace, and the number of projects and initiatives that CEO can prudently greenlight. Let's talk about PayPal. Back in the day, everybody talks about the critical density of talent we had at PayPal. That was fairly unique. Of the 254 people in Mountain View at IPO, between 10 and 17 people might have been barrels. That's an incredibly high ratio, but it's still 10 to 17. But that's maybe an order of magnitude, at least half order of magnitude, better than a very healthy, very successful startup. So you're always looking for barrels. Minting barrels is incredible because you've just added the ability to say yes to some new project, and with a shot of some asymmetry, so 3 asymmetric bets versus 1, if they're in the right hands, it really does change the option value and expected value perhaps of the company. Now, how do you find a barrel? The problem is barrels, you can't really identify from a LinkedIn profile. People who are product managers all look somewhat similar, engineers look somewhat similar, blah, blah, blah. You really need context, and they need to probably be context in your culture. What would be kind of person to be a successful barrel at Apple is almost surely different than one who would thrive at Google, for example. And those are both great companies, both iconic companies. So you need to watch people within your organization typically. And this is where the expand the scope and challenge, sort of advice from David Sachs, actually originally at PayPal, kicks in, which is the way you tell is you start with someone and you give them a project. And, it might have a defined scope. It might be something that's relatively challenging, but not extraordinary. And then if they thrive and they succeed, then give them something more complicated, more challenging, and push the envelope and just rinse and repeat. And then you watch, and you can do that one by one. Another sort of hack I sort of developed if you have one office is you just watch who goes to whose desk. And when you see a flock of people going to the same person's desk, especially if they don't report to that person, that's a sign that this person's both got influence and people are flocking to this person's desk because they think they can help. And if other people in the organization think this person can help solve real problems, they almost surely can.
Let's talk about supervising, where you argue that degrees of micromanagement should vary depending on the task-relevant maturity of an employee. I think Andy Grove talks about
Yes, this is high output management, 1982.
Yeah.
Nothing original, I'm just restating it.
How does that work? What does that look like?
Well, basically, different people have different levels of task-relevant maturity. As the CEO, you're always responsible for the results of the organization. You are always accountable, always responsible. So what you want to do is sample or edit, just like a manufacturing process, which is why the book is entitled High Output Management. If you read the first chapter, it's all about running a factory, like a startup's like a factory. So you're sampling, and you're basically sampling quality at different sort of paces, just like you would in a manufacturing process. So, if you're creating chips, you have to have a 99.9999 whatever, sort of success rate. You can't have defects or your products, like the economics just don't work. And that's how semiconductor chip sampling goes. And it's like people. People have different propensities to make mistakes or succeed. And you're going to intervene at different sort of rates based upon the evidence about how successful they're like to be. So some people who've never done X, Y, or Z before, you may need to sample every day. Probably not every hour, but every day. Some people may have tackled this exact problem successfully 3 times before. You might sample that every quarter. And so having a different propensity to sample and then different level of editorial feedback based upon the person's curriculum, prior curriculum, is the general simplification of his advice in high output management, but I think everybody should read the original.
Let's talk about delegating quickly. You use a framework of a 2x2 matrix for whether or not to delegate based on the consequences of the decision on the x-axis and your level of conviction on the y. So if you're high conviction for a high consequence decision, you decide for yourself. If you're low conviction for a low consequence decision, delegate the decision. But what about those other 2 scenarios? If an important decision you have low conviction in or something you believe in strongly but just doesn't matter that much, what do you do?
Yeah, so the easy quadrant is high conviction and high consequence. That's what you get paid for as the CEO founder. Low conviction, low importance. You don't want to delegate. First of all, just to see, learn. You can learn about your colleagues, how good are they? So it's an opportunity for them to stretch and build muscle, but also you to observe how strong are their muscles. So those are great. The hard ones, and the hardest one is probably high consequence, low conviction. That's the one that matters the most. And then there's a set of techniques about what you do. And I address this in some length in my How to Operate lecture in YC that I gave in 2014, I think. So short version is some of those, basically it's just what can I do to get smarter? What information can I get specifically that would improve the probabilities of making the right call? Usually people are very, let's say, lackadaisical in addressing this problem. They say, for example, let's wait, or let's study this, but they don't specifically identify what information, if I had, would alter the probabilities of making the call this way versus that way. Because then you could dispatch people to get that information or find a proxy for the information. And you can define a timeline of we'll know this information by tomorrow, we'll know it next week or next month. So you're not procrastinating a difficult decision. The other framework is something I borrowed from the military, which is you basically want to make those calls at about a 70% conviction as a startup. You don't want to wait to 99%. It's basically 70% probably the speed, 70% with 70% you want to violently execute the decision. I also believe in this concept from Madoff of path dependency, which is making the decision and deciding that you're going to be successful is more important than the option value of waiting most of the time. And so I think there are a set of techniques of addressing that, but that is by far the hardest quadrant.
Two more for you. One is you've done a 180 on your old beliefs and now insist that as a founder, you should be measuring inputs, not outputs in your organization. What does that practically mean and why do you change it?
Quality of thinking. So inputs are how thoughtful, how compelling is the analysis in tackling a problem. Outputs are the results. So I've shifted from a results orientation to an input orientation. Jeff Bezos explains this the best. So he basically articulates the reason why outputs are dangerous, which is first, if you want to do something incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging, if you tell people in your organization, signal to people that they're going to get measured on the output, a lot of your best people aren't going to raise their hand because they know it's difficult. They know the probability of success is 10%. And so if an organization thinks that the only way you get promoted, the only way you're compensated, successfully, the only way people respect you is by the results, no one's going to sign up for your 10% degree of difficulty challenge, but that can be the asymmetric advantage that propels the company for the next decade. And so you want your best people raising their hand, not your worst people. So that alone is compelling to me. Just watching organizations as we have a real significant challenge, I want the 3 best people in the organization to tackle it. And if they know they're smart, they're savvy, that's why they're the 3 best people. They know that the probability of success is only 10, 15, 20%. And so I want to orient the incentives differently. So quality thinking. This is also very true in investing. I think at KV, we're very disciplined about quality of thinking and inputs, not just looking at the returns. So we all send memos or emails about investment, and we gauge our colleagues by the quality of thinking in the memo, the analysis, and the level of insight into the 3 most important questions, for example, the assessment of the founder. That's more important as we assess our colleagues than a decade later, the output. Over some time frame, a decade, 2 decades in venture, and maybe 2-4 years in a startup, those things harmonize. Quality of thinking, inputs do track and harmonize with outputs. A Larry Summersism of this is over the long time frame, merit shows itself. And I think that's true. But in long lead time investments as a VC or in a startup, there's a disconnect. And so being able to lean on the inputs is much more successful. There's another great book, by the way, I highly recommend, The Score Takes Care of Itself by Bill Walsh, who's a famous football coach. And he basically prescribes this methodology that if you want to win football games, you want to win the Super Bowl, which was his goal, and he was very successful at it actually, starting with a very losing team and very incompetent organization into a repeat Super Bowl champion, started with the inputs. Literally the inputs of, here's a manual on how to properly answer the phone call if you're a receptionist, to here's how you run your route as a receiver, and that if you do every single thing, every single day correctly, eventually the score, i.e. the game result, will take care of itself because you've done every possible thing to create an advantage for yourself, and that's going to turn into wins, and it did.
On the topic of measurement, let's talk about metrics as we close out here. It's clear that simply spending money isn't really a good solution to growth. To be strategic, you need to look at your business like an equation, see its levers, their trade-offs, and understand the impact of moving a lever on other parts of the equation. You're notoriously obsessive on CAC to payback ratios. Why does that matter, and what are other important company metrics that you think are chronically appreciated?
Other than the founder assessment, which is the primary reason I invest or don't invest in a startup, if the business is operational, meaning it's running as a product in the market, it's trying to scale, the most important metric to me by far, probably by an order of magnitude versus any other metrics, is just payback, time to payback. The reason why is, first of all, it's standardized across a wide swath of startups. How do you compare like a Traba to a Ramp? very different markets, very different stages, but you can use payback. Generally speaking, long payback means your product value proposition either is limited or your ability to articulate and communicate it is poor. And when you have a clear value proposition that is compelling to a target set of customers, the product sells, just moves off the shelf. So you're overcoming inertia, and the more expensive overcoming inertia is, the more diluted the value proposition is or the articulation. And so payback kind of gives you a feel for that of like, okay, great. I see this ratio. It shows me how much friction there is in the system, which is actually another physics concept. One of the reasons why I think physics majors do really well as founders. You can borrow so much from physics. Anyway, so I use that. It normalizes really well. Secondly, it tends to mean that the startup also is relatively capital efficient. Obviously, if your payback time is what we call tight, like let's say sub 6 months, the fact you're growing, but you're getting revenue in healthy revenue because you measure payback by contribution dollars, you're getting healthy dollars back even while you're growing. So your need to depend upon external finance is significantly less than, let's say, if your payback time was a year. You might need 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x more capital just to grow at the same rate. So I think that can be like junk food growth sometimes. So roughly speaking, below 6 months, I'm like thrilled. 6 to 9 months, I think, can be very attractive. Over 12 months, I'm almost never impressed.
I've got one more question for you.
Sure.
Same one I ask at the end of every interview. I think last time I asked you this, you said sleep in the upside of stress. So what should more people be thinking about?
Those are good answers. I don't know if the world's changed that much in 2 years since we last did this, but I think sleep, every day that goes by, every month that goes by, every year that goes by, people are going to realize that sleep is the most important thing you can do to improve your life, your happiness, your professional success, and certainly your health. Brian Johnson, actually is on this crusade where he does a billion different things, spends $1 billion, trying to live longer. But in the last 2 months, I've noticed that he started distilling the wisdom down to just sleep, and he's right. Second thing is, I think you want to challenge yourself. Like, you're on this planet to accomplish something, to do something. My favorite proverb is from Ben Franklin, which is, you either want to write something worth reading or do something worth writing about. So I think the way you do that is you constantly challenge yourself, and stress is your body's barometer of whether you're actually challenging yourself.
Keith, that's all I got for you.
Great, thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.